Hi again. I am so glad you tuned in to another one of the stories we've been talking about. This is old stories for young ears, and they're stories that I'm sharing with you from my personal favorite book, and that's the Bible. And we've started by looking at some stories in the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. And you know, it's kind of interesting. We talked about creation, we talked about Adam and Eve, we talked about Cain and Abel and Noah, and last time we talked about the Tower of Babel. And I want you to think about taking all those when you take all those stories together. It seems like right at the beginning when God made everything and when he made people and when he made Adam and Eve, you know, God and people were really, really, really close. But as those stories we've talked about as they've gone on, it seems as though God and people have gotten more and more separated, right? I mean, good night, Cain did something terrible to his brother. And then during the time of Noah, people running around acting crazy. And remember last week when we looked at the Tower of Babel, folks started to assume they'd be like God. And as a result, they ended up being scattered and spoke different languages and couldn't get along. And so as we looked at those stories from Genesis, it seems as though God and people were getting further and further apart. Now, that wasn't really God's fault. God still loved people, but people wanted to do more and more their own thing. Now, we're going to start talking during this episode about the person who starts reversing that, starts bringing people closer to God. And that person is going to be Jesus Christ. Now, I know you've heard about Jesus before. I know that you recognize the name. We're going to talk about some of the stories about Jesus. Now, you want to maybe remember some of the things that you've heard about Jesus, either from your mom or dad, or maybe in church, in Sunday school, something like that. And we're going to start right at the beginning. In fact, during this episode, we're going to talk about a story that happened before Jesus was even born, which is kind of cool when you think about it. But before we do that, I want to ask you a question. Uh, have you ever doubted somebody? Do you know what doubt means? Somebody tells you something and you say, man, that's not right. Like if I said to you, if I said, you know what I did this afternoon? I went outside, you could believe that, and I started flapping my arms, and you know what happened? I started flying around. Now, if I told you that, do you think that happened? No. You doubt it, right? Because it just doesn't make sense. And we're going to talk now for human beings. I can't flap my arms and fly around in the sky, but you know, God's a little different because where we can't do certain things, God, his abilities and his powers are unlimited. And so, although we may doubt one another, we probably don't want to doubt God because God is all powerful. He can take care of us. Okay, and the story I'm going to share with you today is about a guy who doubted God. And it turned out that God was right, and in the end, this guy and his lovely bride, his lovely wife, were very, very, very happy. And things worked out really well, and in fact, moved us toward the story of Jesus. Okay, now this is a story. And I've got two little figures here. There was a guy named Zachariah. Now, we want to pretend, I know this is a bear, but we're going to pretend he's Zachariah. Okay? So he's Zachariah, and Zachariah was a priest. Now, you may know priests, your church may have priests, or maybe pastor or minister or something like that. Anyway, Zachariah worked in the church, and back then the church was called the temple. It was a huge building, and Zachariah got to work in that building one weekend a year. Okay, so it was very, very important to him. So Zachariah right here, hi, my name is Zachariah. Zachariah is a priest, and he's married to a fine lady named Elizabeth. Okay, now Elizabeth, we're going to talk about Mary a little bit later, not today, but in another episode. Elizabeth is Mary's cousin. And do you know who Mary was? Yeah, that's right. Mary was the mother of Jesus. So Elizabeth is going to be related to Jesus through Mary. Anyway, Zachariah, the priest, and Elizabeth, they were married and they loved each other. Look, they're hugging. Oh, they love each other. They have good times. You know, there's only one problem with Zachariah and Elizabeth. They don't have any kids. And they really, really wanted to be parents. They really wanted to be parents. But they didn't have any kids. And they'd gotten older and had no kids. And when a person gets older, it's not possible for them to have children anymore. At least not on their own. They can adopt, but they can't have their own kids. You can have grandkids, but you can't have children when you hit a certain age. And they had hit that certain age. So they had kind of made up their mind that they weren't going to be parents. Okay. And what's her name? Elizabeth. And what's his name? Zachariah. You're right. Okay. So Zachariah, like I said, gets to work at the temple one weekend a year. And it was his weekend coming up. So he says to his wife, says to Elizabeth, Elizabeth, I'm going to the temple to do my one weekend. And Elizabeth says, okay, that sounds pretty good to me. That happens every year. Okay, we're good with that. And he says, I'll be right back after I finish. And she says, okay, I'll be looking for you. And they hug, and he gives her a little kiss. They kiss one another. And she goes on home, and he travels to the temple to do his little job. Okay? Well, in the temple, he's working. He's doing his job. And all of a sudden, one day in the temple, Zachariah is looking up and saying, man, that is a cool looking ceiling. That is really neat. All of a sudden, there's wings flapping. You know, talked about me flapping my arms. Well, these were wings. And Zachariah says, what is going on here? And you know what all of a sudden appears in the temple? An angel. And where do angels come from? They come from heaven, right? They're messengers of God. And all of a sudden, as Zachariah is looking up, this angel appears to him. And Zachariah, well, if you saw an angel appear in front of you, what would you feel? How would you feel? Well, I'll tell you something. Zachariah is scared. He is really scared because of an angel. And the angel sees him and says, Zachariah, you don't need to be afraid of me because I'm on your side. I really like you. In fact, Zachariah, I've got a great message for you. It comes from God himself. This is God speaking to you. And Zachariah says, whoa, what does God have to say to me? What message does God want me to know? And the angel says, well, Zachariah, this is the message. You are going to be a daddy because your wife Elizabeth is going to have herself a baby. Zachariah says, what are you talking about? I'm an old man. Elizabeth's an old woman. We can't have kids. We're too old. I think you're visiting the wrong person. Maybe you need to see the priest down the hall. And the angel says, no, the message is for you. You're going to be a daddy. And Zachariah says, I don't think that's possible. I don't think I'm going to be a daddy. And the angel said, boy, I wish you hadn't said that. Because, see, it may not be possible for people, but nothing is impossible for God. And your wife is going to have a baby. You're going to be a daddy. And your son, you're going to name him John, and he is going to be an important person. In fact, he's going to be the person that's going to tell folks about Jesus. And Zachariah is still kind of confused by that. And the angel said, you know, Zachariah, because you doubted me, I'm going to give you a sign that what I'm saying is true. You're not going to be able to say a single word until your son comes, until your wife has her baby, until you become a daddy. You can't say a single word. And Zachariah looks at the angel and he says, can't speak, can't say a word. Zachariah says, but he's thinking. He says, man, I can't speak. Maybe what that angel says is true. So Zachariah can't say anything. So he kind of waves goodbye to the angel. Angel flies away. Zachariah comes out of the room. People say, "Hey, Zachariah, we heard somebody talking in there. Was that you?" And Zachariah says, and somebody says, "Wait, what's wrong with Zachariah? Get him a pad and a pencil." And they give it to him, and they say, "Zachariah, what is it that happened to you?" And Zachariah writes down, "Well, an angel appeared to me and says that I'm going to be a daddy. My wife Elizabeth is going to have a baby. The baby's going to grow up to be a really important guy, and until that baby comes, I'm not able to talk." And people read that and say, "Well, I don't know about the other stuff, but the not talking is certainly right." Well, okay. And so Zachariah does his work in silence, and he goes on home. And who's waiting for him when he gets home? You know it. It's Elizabeth. And Elizabeth says, "Zachariah, before you say a word, I got big, big news for you. Big news." What do you think it is? She says, "I've been to the doctor, and you know what the doctor told me? I'm going to have a baby. We're going to be parents. Can you believe it? I think this is impossible, but we're going to be parents. What do you think of that, Zachariah?" And Zachariah says, still can't talk, right? Because he can't talk, and he's not going to be able to talk till the baby comes. And Elizabeth says, "I'm sorry, I didn't get that." And Zachariah says, so Elizabeth goes and gets Zachariah a pad and a pencil, and Zachariah writes down what happened to him at the temple, how the angel appeared, and how he made the promise that Elizabeth was going to have a baby, he was going to be a daddy, and how the angel said he wouldn't be able to talk until the baby came. And so Elizabeth reads the note and says, "Well, I'm going to have a baby. So what the angel said must be right." And she started thinking about this business, about how the baby was going to be really, really important. Okay. So she's happy. Zachariah is not able to talk, which may have made her even happier that Zachariah isn't talking, because he's not complaining about stuff anymore. And so they're living their life, and they're doing their thing, and they love each other. And Elizabeth, and what happens when a woman is expecting a baby? What happens to her? Well, her tummy gets really, really big, because that's where the baby is. And so Elizabeth was getting big. Her tummy was getting big because she was going to have a baby. And closer and closer it came, and we'll talk about something that happens before she has a baby. We'll talk about that next time. But she's going to have a baby, and finally the big day comes. And she says, "Zachariah." And Zachariah says, "Whoop, whoop." And she says, "I'm going to have a baby. I think I'm going to have the baby right now." And Zachariah says, "Oh." And he gets her and takes her to the hospital, boom, and she goes into labor, and the doctor comes and says, "Push, push, push," and Elizabeth, boom, has her baby, and it's a cute little baby boy. Cute little baby boy. Well, when she has this little baby, all the people around, and they're real happy because they like Zachariah and Elizabeth, and they're glad that they're parents now, and they ask Elizabeth, "Hey, what you gonna call your baby?" And she says, "Well, I don't know. You're gonna need to ask his daddy, because his daddy's got a name in mind." And so the people come to Zachariah and say, "What are you gonna call your baby?" And Zachariah says, and they say, "I'm sorry, I didn't get that." And Zachariah says, and they bring him a pad and pencil. And on the pad, he writes the name John. And people look at that and say, "John? There's no John in your family. There's Zachariah. Why don't you call him Zachariah Jr.? Why don't you call him Zachariah Jr.? Then he's kind of named after you." And he writes John again. And they say, "Okay, I will name him John." And they bring the baby to Zachariah, and Zachariah holds the baby in his arms. And when he looks down at the baby in his arms, all of a sudden, Zachariah can speak. His voice comes back, because remember what the angel said. When the baby is born, you'll be able to talk again. And Zachariah is so happy. He is running around and he's telling folks all about his son. And he's saying his name is going to be John, and John's going to grow up to be a great person. But most of what Zachariah did was he was praising God. You see, Zachariah doubted God, but it didn't change, but it didn't cause God to change his mind. And Zachariah still became a daddy, and his little baby was named John. And remember what else the angel said? That little baby was going to grow up to be a really important person. That's the story for today, the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth and little baby John. Now, next week, we're going to talk about Elizabeth's cousin, and that's Mary. And just like an angel appeared to Zachariah, an angel is going to appear to Mary. Only the angel that appears to Mary is going to tell her about the baby she's going to have. And the baby she's going to have is going to be named what? You're 100% right. The baby she's going to have is going to be named Jesus. So if you want to hear the story about Mary and the angel, I want you to tune in next week. Should be next Wednesday or Thursday. So I'm glad you listened again. I hope you enjoyed the story. I sure did. And I want you to remember, wherever you go or whatever you do, you are a child of God. And God loves you very, very much. I'll see you next week.